Hi, everybody. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze. Welcome back. If you were just watching our previous interview, I'm Jenna Blum, and I am the co-founder of The Mighty Blaze. Today, I have as a very special guest to talk about memoir, Sandell Morse. Welcome, Sandell. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. I want to welcome those of you to The Blaze who have not joined us before by saying we are an organization of 35 as of last week volunteers connecting writers and readers in the age of COVID and beyond. And if you like what you see here today, please give us a like or a follow on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, where all of our interviews going back to March 2020 are archived. So kind of a literary history. And also sign up for our newsletter, which is at www.mightyblaze.com, so that you'll always be apprised of upcoming literary events. No FOMO. Literary FOMO, very dangerous condition. You don't want that. So today's guest, Sandell, is very special to me, and I will talk a little bit more about why. But if you don't mind, I'd love to introduce you by your official bio.
Thank you.
Okay, so buckle up. Here's you. Sandell Morse is the author of The Spiral Shell, which is a memoir that I love. A French village reveals its secrets of Jewish resistance in World War II. She is published widely in literary magazines, including Plowshares, which rejected me so many times, I can't even tell you, the New England Review, Ascent, Fourth Genre, Solstice, and Brevity. You have won awards from the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance and been nominated for 2 Pushcarts and Best of the Net. You've been an associate artist at Atlantic Center for the Arts, a fellow at Virginia Center for Creative Arts, and been awarded residencies from Wild Acres and Hoon Oaks. And you live in New Hampshire, where you ski like a total badass, as we see from following you on social media. And I would just like to tell our audience that I met Sandell at a social media seminar I was teaching in Maine, I want to say.
You were in Maine, yes.
I was in Maine. Okay, good. I never know exactly where I am. But this is a class full of writers wanting to learn and also phobic to learn about social media. And Sandell is like in the second row, like not in the scary front row, but like in the second row, asking such great questions and was like more with it about social than a lot of the writers I know who work in this medium every day. And I'm so impressed by you. And I also wanted to say, for those of you watching, you should be truly inspired, because Sandell published Spiral Shell when she was 81. And I'm like, I don't even believe you're a day over 65, but whatever. Like, to publish your first book at 81 is such an extraordinary accomplishment, and I would love to unpack that a little. But first, if you would, can you talk to our audience, tell us what Spiral Shell is about in your own words?
Oh, the Spiral Shell is really a double journey. And I thought, writing essays about people that I was researching in a small village in France. I started out with just a name, and that name was Jean Hirsch. And my maiden name is Hirsch. So I became very, very interested in that subject. And I think I have been on this journey all my life. It's about identity, really. And so I'm on a journey to uncover secrets of World War II Jewish resistance in this tiny village, a subject that expanded beyond my wildest dreams. And I'm also on a spiritual journey of my own. I don't know that either, but I was a very, very assimilated Jew growing up. And France, the Jews in France were also very, very assimilated. And I began interviewing a woman, Germaine Poliakov, who was 92 when I met her. And she was still hiding her Judaism after the war, afraid to say that she was Jewish. And she had lived through the war. She had protected Jewish refugee children during the war. And she had chosen to do that rather than live in safety with her parents, who lived under false passports, false baptism certificates, and false identity. And I thought to myself, that's not what I want to do anymore. I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to be Jewish only among my Jewish friends and my family and hang a wreath on my door at Christmas time. I don't want to do that. So that book is about a search for identity for myself that I come to only after I've made this journey through France, interviewing a number of people and learning the history of Vichy France. I knew nothing about it.
That's so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. One of the questions that I had for you was about how the book changed you while you were writing it. I think all of us who are writers who work on long form projects find ourselves changing while we write, partly because novels and memoirs take a long time to write, usually. So of course you're going to change over that, 1 or 3 or 5 years or 20 years when you're writing a book. But some books, especially memoirs, I feel they are interactive in that way, and they really force a sea change in the author, helping her make discoveries about herself. Is that the main discovery you would say you made while you were writing Spiral Shell? That you wanted to be more overtly Jewish?
So I think there was a moment where I was interviewing Germaine, and she was telling me the story of, and she was 92, and she was had recently gone to a concert with a friend of hers, and the friend leaned over and whispered and said, "That conductor, he is Jewish, or he is a Jew." And Germaine said to me, she wouldn't have said that if he was a Christian. And then her daughter, Germaine's daughter, who I had met and we interviewed with as well, said, yes, but she might have said it if he was Chinese. And then her daughter said to me, that's all the French know here. They don't know, Koreans or Japanese or Filipinos. They know just Chinese. Everybody Asian is Chinese. And I'm thinking to myself, I want Germaine to say to that woman, I am Jewish. And she did not. And she said she could not. And I thought, well, I want to say to the world, I am Jewish. And I think that was the moment.
That's a beautiful moment. Thank you for describing that. I have often felt, because I'm half Jewish, and you and I could be related. We look very similar.
Right.
It's like I'm just giving myself a giant compliment there. But there have been so many times, because I have blonde hair that I got from my Norwegian grandmother and from my dad, who was Jewish and had blonde curly hair. And I got this hair from them. And people would often make comments, just sort of cultural comments to me, like not really anti-Semitic comments, but comments like, oh, I Jewed that guy down in conversation. Or the most shocking one I heard was at an Easter dinner with friends in Minneapolis, when a guy at the table said, oh, Jews drank little Christian children's blood. And that was so astonishing to me, having grown up in New Jersey where there were lots of Jewish people. But I said, where did you even hear that? That is so ridiculous. And he said, well, from college. I mean, they taught it to us in my college courses, in my religion courses. But that was probably the first moment that I owned being a Jewish girl or a half Jewish girl, was in the face of that sort of ignorance and saying that just actually is not true and it's not a thing. Did you feel uneasy or scared before you wrote Spiral Shell to say, hey, I'm Jewish, you guys can't say that in front of me, or at all?
I would always speak up if someone said something anti-Semitic. But I had a friend who used that phrase, oh, he Jewed me down. And I listened to it. I didn't say anything to her. And she used it all the time. And I was brought up living in very small towns in New Jersey and then in Florida. And that's another huge story. And so I was always in a minority, and my folks moved around a lot. So that felt even more jarring. And I wanted to fit in. I just really wanted to fit in. And so I would never say I was Jewish until I heard an anti-Semitic remark. And then I would say, I'm Jewish, And then I would get the response that I kind of was fishing for, which you got all the time. You can't be. You don't look Jewish. And so I took a kind of false or destructive kind of pride in that, of not looking Jewish, because I could pass. I could look like everybody else. So I was working with all of that when I was writing the memoir. And I think I came out a more integrated person after that, after the book.
So the book did you a great service, even as you were doing us a service, bringing it out into the world.
Oh.
I think about this conversation of, passing, sort of passing, and we hear that a lot from people of color, but I've always felt that about being Jewish or half Jewish as well. And it plays off the stereotype that the Nazis, of course, perpetuated of Jews looking a certain way, of being dark complected or having, this nose and these horns and all of these ridiculous stereotypes that they pervaded society with very deliberately. And I think, well, nobody wants to be identified with these negative stereotypes. But I also wonder, and tell me if this feels true for you, if there's a sort of atavistic instinct in like a pride in being able to pass because it feels safer, right? Like at the beginning of the Trump administration, I remember having a conversation with a woman who runs this beautiful podcast called Under the Same Sky about collecting Holocaust survivors' memories and threading them down through generations. Mm-hmm. And we talked, it was the first time I had ever mentioned this, but we talked very openly about being afraid and how my whole life as a half Jewish girl, I had this room in my attic that I was going to go to when the Nazis came, just like Anne Frank had. And when I was a kid, I stocked it with cookies and books and flashlights and water and my essential stuffed animals. And, I really believed that there was going to come a time when the Nazis would come marching up my driveway and I would have to hide or run. And then during the Trump era, I was not surprised by the anti-Semitism because part of me had expected it all along that this would happen. So do you feel maybe that part of your instinct in hiding who you were or concealing or being able to pass was atavistic and a survival mechanism? What do you think that was about for you?
I think for me, it was more about shame. I think that I was ashamed. Well, it has to do with so many things because I really grew up in the shadow of the Second World War. And there were there were so many myths floating around at that time. So I was born in 1939. So I have vivid memories of wartime things. I have vivid memories of the blue ration stamps. And I have vivid memories of, cousins all in their uniforms, their portraits on baby grand pianos. I have a vivid memory of the civil defense guy walking by the window yelling, screaming, lights out, lights out. Mm. And so that kind of fear was built in to me. And the shame came, I think, we didn't know exactly. I had no idea what was happening to the Jews, but we knew it was horrible. And afterwards, my family never talked about it because there was shame involved. There was the mythology of Jews walking to their deaths like sheep. And I carried that image with me all of my life. In fact, when I went to Dartmouth, I was in middle age and I was matriculating for a Master of Arts in Liberal Studies. And I was taking a class called Dealing with the Past. It was taught by a religious professor. His name was Stephen Katz. I had no idea he was this great, brilliant Holocaust scholar. No idea. And and an English professor. And so we could write our paper for either one. And so I went to see him because I had very little Jewish education. I knew nothing about anything. And I said, well, I'd kind of like to write my paper, but I don't know what I want to write it about. And we had a chat and we came to this image that had haunted me all of my life. And that was the Jews marching in the forest with the Nazis with their machine guns and very orderly manner going to their deaths. And I was always a fighter as a kid. And so what I wanted was everybody to rise up and claw them to death. And he said, well, here I get this from this professor. Are you Jewish? I said, yes. Both sides? I said, yes. And I'm thinking, well, this is weird. And then he said, you're really interested in that question? And I said, yes. He said, well, go find out. So I wish I had that paper. It's one paper I have lost. And so with the chutzpah of someone who really knew nothing, I titled my paper Against Hannah Arendt because I took issue with her statement about the banality of evil. Now I understand what she was saying, but then it was, to me, evil is never banal kind of thing. But what I did was I researched the Holocaust, and I researched and I read a tremendous amount. So I would say my education started there, but the shame dates from my childhood, and also the stereotyping.
Stereotyping is terrible, as we were talking about, but there is that sort of dual shameful stereotype of like Jews being sneaky, or I wrote about a lot of this in my first novel, Those Who Save Us. I was able to unpack a lot of what I had been carrying around my whole life, hearing these things, or Jews will cheat you, or they'll swindle you, or but then there's also the mythology that Jews were victims and did go meekly to their deaths. And
Right.
I interviewed survivors for the Spielberg Foundation for 4.5 years in the late 90s. And I was so greatly privileged to interview, for instance, resistance fighters from the Warsaw Ghetto, and also smugglers from the ghetto, and people who had led uprisings, Jews who had survived by living as partisans in the forest, but fighting back, like teaming up with Russians. So the more I dug into the history, the more I realized that also the stereotype of Jews as victims was a myth that had been perpetuated, but it was a really hard thing to grow up with. I understand feeling the long shadow of that. So you said you read a lot about the Holocaust. What kind of emotional effect did that have on you?
You know, Jenna, that's a really interesting question because people have said to me, this must have been so difficult for you. And I didn't see it as difficult for me, I think, until afterwards. I was, 71, 72, 71, I guess, when I started this work. And I had never crossed the ocean solo in my life. And I was just feeling as if something magical was happening to me, and I was on my own, and things started opening up. For example, I went to see my rabbi, a dear friend, when I started this project, to talk to him about it. And he introduced me to a friend of his who lived in Paris, who was a Jewish scholar, spoke beautiful English. In fact, he'd performed the marriage ceremony for Valerie and Thierry, because Thierry was Catholic, Valerie Jewish, and no rabbi in all of France would marry them. So Lev crossed the ocean and married them. And then Valerie introduced me to Germaine Poliakov. Germaine introduced me to Yvonne Lieser, who was a child that she cared for in the secret house in Beaulieu. And then in the village where I stayed, the same thing happened. One introduction, another introduction, another introduction. And I was so busy immersing myself in what I was doing, I didn't feel the emotional impact until later, I think.
And what did that feel like when it came out?
Oh my gosh. I had carried a heaviness with me that I didn't realize that I'd carried. And it still lingers today. And I always, before an interview, I'd start reading a little bit of my book again, so that because it's out of your head, you're doing so many other things. So I wanted to put it back, and then I feel myself sinking down into that time. And there is a heaviness that I think I will always carry now. Not constantly, but it's there.
That makes sense to me. People used to say when I was working on Those Who Save Us, or when I had published it, they would say, well, you're so sunny in affect, and how could you have written such a dark, dark book? Because, of course, anytime you're writing about this era, it does have tremendous weight, of course. And for me, I had always said, well, this book was really cathartic to write because I had been carrying these visions in my head around since I was a very little girl playing the Anne Frank game, like who would save me and let's run to the attic. At the same time, I think it was maybe 2 decades later when I was starting to write my third book, and it was about the same time period, that I thought, wow, I'm having a hard time envisioning the really bad circumstances I need to put my main character in. And I realized that I had been having like a sort of emotional sunburn that had taken some time to develop from that first book. At the same time, I think that even though it's something I carry, it seems like such a privilege to me to be the recipient of these stories that survivors told me, or to make sure that people know this grim history, even if you're refracting it through fiction. You're doing it through memoir. This, in some ways, I think is harder. And I was really struck reading The Spiral Shell, how brave you were to keep knocking on doors when you were in France and asking tough questions, because you make it sound easy, like this door open and that door open, that door open. But I remember reading in the early pages of the book that sometimes people would close their curtains to you if you were looking in, thinking like, who is hidden in this house, or, what happened in this house? And literally curtains would be drawn in front of your eyes. You would ask tour guides questions about like, were there Jews living here? What happened to them? Non plus, right? So what gave you the courage to keep asking in a culture that was so directly affected by the war, those questions about the war? That's really hard to do.
It's really, I'm stubborn. I have this great need to dig and find truth. And I think that's what that was about. I don't like cover-ups. I can forgive, I think, almost anything, but I don't like cover-ups at all. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. And I think that we must actually be related in some way, because I love to be told no, in a sense, because then I will go and knock on the doors all the more. I do not like to be told no. I'm very stubborn. So yeah, knowing that somebody's keeping something secret from you is an excellent way to make people like you and me knock on the doors, right?
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the resistance that you encountered, and not like the French resistance pushing back against the Nazis, but the resistance to talking about this era that you initially found in some of your subjects, and how you pushed past that?
Well, I think with Germaine, who was my main subject, when I first started interviewing her, she had, I think she recorded for Spielberg's project. And she was married to a very famous French historian, Leon Poliakov, and he actually accompanied the French delegation to Nuremberg. And he was an intellectual, and he was a professor, but he worked all during the war in resistance. They didn't know each other during the war. They married afterwards. And so what was your question, Jenna?
About and the people you met were extraordinary, so I can see them sort of like pulling you toward them. But the resistance that some people had to talking about this time period, and how you managed to push through that, especially because you're not a native French speaker either, so you have a language barrier. How did you get people to open up?
Well, I think with Germaine, it was friendship. We clicked. And I interviewed her a number of times. I went back to France. It was over a period of 7 or 8 years. And I went back every year. I went back 1 year twice. I stayed for a month every time I went. And I spent time in the village, and I spent time, always spent at least a week in Paris. And I began to know people, or come up with people that Germaine knew or had contact with. For example, in the village of Auvillard, I discovered that in investigating the Hirsch family, that there was a home that protected Jewish refugee children, not in Auvillard, but in Moissac, which is about 20 miles away, and a very different culture and a very different way of dealing with Jews in wartime. And that house was run by Jean Hirsch's father's sister, his aunt, and her husband, and they were Shata and somebody, Simone, I think. Well, I mentioned this to Germaine. Of course, she knows them. So this kind of, I began to uncover networks of people who knew each other and who worked together. And I had began to gather knowledge of the area. I could ask her questions that were not the kind of prepared or ordinary questions because I had more knowledge to do that. As for the villagers, I mostly went around them and I learned who would or who would not talk to me. And I was having an interview in Ovilar with a woman in her 80s who actually worked for Jean Hirsch's father. And I was sitting there with Gerhard Schneider, who became a wonderful, valued source for me. He lived in the village. He's German. He was a theologian and a philosopher and retired to Ovilar, very interested in Jewish history because he was on the other side. He was German, grew up. He was born in 41. So his parents really experienced the war. And they were actually against Hitler, but his father fought for Hitler. He had no choice. So you have all this stuff going on. And so then I was sitting there with Gerhard and Odette, and someone knocked on the door and she went to answer, and this woman came in, and Gerhard shot me a look, and I knew I had to shut up. I couldn't, I couldn't talk about what we had been talking about.
Because she would have shut it down?
She was very, very anti talking about this time. She was very anti the Hirsch family. And there's things in the book, as you know, that happened to them. And there was a huge conflict between them and between Seiseman, Jean Hirsch's father, and the villagers. So I don't know that I talked to anyone who was really, I would say, anti-Semitic or a collaborator. But I talked to people who knew those people and had experienced that. And I think it was kind of warmth and friendship that opened things up.
Interesting.
And I might say something else, Jenna. Just occurred to me. They might have been waiting to talk about this. I know in a way Germaine was, because folks used to come to listen to Léon, her husband, and never to her. So she was happy to tell her story.
And was that the first time she had talked about what she had done during the war, saving children?
It's the first time, no, but it's the first time she ever talked about anything personal. It was the first time she talked about her first husband and about his unfaithfulness and about her life after post-war, coming back to Paris post-war with 3 children and no husband and no money. And yeah, she's quite a wonderful woman.
That is such an amazing story. When I was interviewing survivors, many of them were telling their stories for the first time ever, including to their spouses, even though many of the spouses were also survivors. They would know sort of the basic shape of each other's stories, but it was too hard to revisit that time. They had put them in compartmentalized boxes and not reopened them. And so it is a great position of privilege and also of delicacy to do what you did, and bravery to ask these questions, but especially as survivors aged and as resistance fighters aged, they wanted to tell those stories. So preserving this is so important. What you've done is so important. Can you talk a little bit about, because I know we have audience questions, but I really wanted to ask this of you about the persistence. I think if there are one theme in this interview so far, it would be persistence. I'm going to persist in getting the story. I'm going to persist in knocking on doors. I'm going to persist in writing. Can you tell me what it felt like to have The Spiral Shell published at 81 after doing 10 years of research and writing your whole life? Like, you've been a writer lifelong, yes?
Not lifelong. No, I started in middle age, but I had a family and I had a husband, and I was living this kind of like double life kind of thing. And I had written novels, and I had written another memoir, and I had couple of agents, and I always talked about myself as kind of like opening the door a crack, but never quite all the way. And so with this, I was very determined. And I said, I'm not going to self-publish. Um, I'm just going to, I did two things. I was looking for agents and publishers at the same time. And I got a bite from Schaffner Press, which is a wonderful press. They're tiny, but Tim Schaffner is amazing. And he didn't take the book right away. And he had some reservations. And so I don't know where I got the nerve to do this. Well, if I rewrote it and did blah, 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 would you take a second look? And he said, yes. So that took about a year. And then he took another look and he said, well, not quite. But he had an editor that he had worked with before, and he suggested I contact her, and I did. And voila.
And they make beautiful books. Like, look at this book, it's gorgeous. If you're listening to this on the podcast, the book again is The Spiral Shell. It's a gorgeous hardback book, and it's also out in audio. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, I wanted an audio book. I don't know why, but it just struck me that I wanted an audio book. Maybe because I love listening to audiobooks in the car. And so my publisher was not willing. He's small. He's not willing to do that, to put the money into that. But I ended up producing it, which means I ended up putting up the money. But he revised the contract so that it's favorable to me. But he took on the task of doing the research into audio companies. And I listened to narrators and took a look, and he worked through IPG, which is Independent Publishers Group, to learn about audiobooks and to see which companies would be good. And he also arranged for them to distribute it. So I have help on both ends with the audiobook, and it came out yesterday. I haven't had the nerve to listen to the whole thing. I've listened to a little bit of it.
What do you think?
I like the narration. I chose this narrator because she wasn't overly dramatic. I didn't want anybody that was overly dramatic. And it's not easy to listen to someone else read your own work. So I liked what I had heard, and I think she did a wonderful, wonderful job. And I am going to buy it, and I am going to listen to it in the car.
I think you should be able to download a copy for free if anybody can. But, push up those sales. And everybody who loves listening to audiobooks, where can we find the audio of The Spiral Shell?
It is on, audio. Yes.
Like Audible, and Libro and Spotify and
Libro and audio. Yes.
Excellent. Yes, we love Libro. Libro is like the Audible version of Bookshop. So if you're able to do free downloads, or you want to do free downloads, you go to Libro. And if you want to go to Audible, it's on Audible as well. I really love audiobooks. I love them when I'm walking the dog. So I listen to a lot of fiction then that is stuff that I'm not listening to for work or for interviews. It's just stuff that I'm test driving. I listen to it all on audio. And also, speaking of driving, you said you like to listen in the car. When I listen to my own books on audio, it's usually like a 2-day trip out to my house in Minnesota in the car. They're like, each book is the perfect length for that. And it's so, I don't know if you've had this experience, so tell me, but when you're listening to somebody else read your work, and I get very caught up in it, there's part of me that sits aside and thinks, oh, wait, that's not actually how I think that character should talk, or, oh, that phrase wasn't quite as I heard it in my own head. But most of the time I'm just enraptured. And I think, oh my God, these poor people, what's going to happen to them, even though I wrote the story? So, I mean, what is it like for you to hear your work read back?
I'm going to let you know on that because I haven't listened to enough to know.
Good.
Really, but I've been afraid really to listen because of the phrasing is the meaning, right? The way someone reads or presents it greatly affects the meaning of the work. So it's been scary, but I'm going to do it now, Jenna. You always
Okay,
get me
good.
started.
Oh, good, good. Okay, well, let us know. And I hope it's a lovely experience. Just take a drive to somewhere you really want to go safely. I know you're vaccinated, right? So you can take a nice long, drive in the country and listen to the book. Let us know what you think. We will let you know what we think. We're all going to order it on audio as well. What has the experience been like of publishing the book? Like, what surprised you? What has the reception been like with readers?
Oh, surprise is like incredible. I have to tell a little tiny story. So when I was at Dartmouth, that's when I started writing middle age. And believe it or not, Ishmael Reed mentored me. And by the time I finished his class, I had a novella. He sent me to his agent in New York. And I'm this innocent thing, but I'm like in my very early 40s, I think. And I brought the manuscript to her because I was going to New York for a weekend. And I remember climbing upstairs to this agent's office and handing her my only typewritten manuscript and saying, well, I'm leaving Monday morning. Could you have it back to me? And she's like, what is
Who
Ishmael
are you?
doing to me? And but she did. She handed it back Monday morning and she said, if you want to publish in the literaries all your life, write like this. If you want to publish with me, go home and read the bestseller list. And I walked down those stairs and I said to myself, I don't think it would be so bad publishing in the literaries. And that's what I did. But when I published this book, it opened an entire world. I had no idea it was going to be that open, that generous, that exciting. It's been wonderful.
I'm so gratified to hear that and glad. What did she mean by the literaries? I'm fascinated by this. What did she mean?
The literary magazines like Plowshares, like, Fourth Genre, every place I've published, all of those.
Right. And you can do both. I started out publishing in the literaries, writing short stories and submitting them and getting rejected and submitting and resubmitting and doing that for like 20 years, working in food service and finally pushing my way through. And then you can write a novel or a memoir that reads like literary writing and yet has broad appeal.
Well, I did write a number of novels, Jenna, and they never just made it. And you know what I, of course, have figured out all these years later, I just didn't push them far enough. And that's another thing, like to talk to writers about, that you might have the book, but it needs to be pushed maybe one or two more times before it really is ready for publication.
That is such good writing advice. There are many writers I know who have a book that's almost there, and then they think, I'll just give this to an agent, and the agent can help me fix it, and then we'll get it out in the world. The editor will help me. And my response is always, you are responsible for your book. And if it's not as pristine as you can humanly make it, it is not ready to go out. If you have that sort of nagging feeling like, oh, this part's a little wobbly or wonky, but like nobody will see that, they will see it. So it's great to have a writing community or a writing coach or a mentor or somebody or an editor who you hire who can help you read through it. And those books may see the light of day yet, right? Are you thinking about repurposing any of your novels that you have in the drawer for publication?
Well, I don't think I have time because I'm working on another memoir right now. And
Excuse me.
Right.
Good for you. What is the new memoir about, if you can talk about it?
Yeah, well, at the same time that I was doing all this work in France, just about at the same time, my granddaughter's mother abandoned her. And her mom and my son had been divorced for 10 years at that point, but she had sole physical custody. And her home was really my granddaughter's home, although my son took her a lot. And it ended up that the two of them ended up moving in with my husband and me, and I was raising a 13-year-old, angry, belligerent, biracial adolescent at the same time that I was working on this. And so it's that story. And it has a lot of similarities to the spiral shell in theme. Nothing like it in, in setting and place. But it's a lot about identity, and it's a lot about mothering. And I raised 3 sons, so this was the daughter I never had, right? But it was tough. So
you have been busy. You have been busy, like having a family and second life, like an encore, and now a memoir and another memoir. Do you have a title for the new memoir yet?
No.
Okay.
It's in my computer file as prose long form.
That's catchy. If you want to write for the literaries, you should call it prose long form. You want to be on the Blaze, you're going to have to call it The Daughter I Never Had, or something along those lines, or my second memoir, something like that. I think we have time for a couple of audience questions. I know that we're getting, hi, Mark. Mark is our thoughtful bro. Writers growing up in America today have no great trauma like World War II. Do we have less to write about, or can talented writers always find good subject matter even in a humdrum existence? That is such a great question, Mark, and especially now when our lives are so circumscribed. What do you think about this question?
I think talented writers can always find something wonderful to write about. I never intended to write about the Holocaust. In fact, I didn't think I could touch it. And I didn't want to do it, and I resisted it for years and years. And I really, I fell down into it. But I do think that you don't need that huge, huge trauma to write. Really, I think in the book I really talk about also the larger picture, which was the World War II drama thing, and then there's the individual life. And I think what makes my book, if it comes alive at all, come alive, is the individual life. It's not the larger backdrop. Although it isn't. War is ongoing. War shapes lives. So many different things in whatever our background is, shapes our life. And then we have to find our individual story.
Beautiful. I think also when I read fiction, it's to see what life feels like in the shoes of somebody else. So you can make art out of just about anything, I think. What did your family think about you writing this book? Did anyone oppose it? Great question, especially for memoirists. This is what we hear all the time for the memoirists.
I've been really lucky. Unfortunately, I'm really sad that my parents, of course, were gone before I published this book. And my 3 sons they've been so supportive and so complimentary. It might help that they're all rather artistic. One of my sons, but 2 of them have MFAs in film, and they're very into film and filmmaking. And one of my sons is a potter, and they're all quite well read, and they love books and literature, and they've been really wonderful. They've just like, Mom, this is really well written.
Were they surprised? They're like, Mom, who knew you could do this also? Do you think it would have been different if you had been writing more directly about people in your family? And would you have had to do more of an eliding sort of dance around people's feelings?
Well, there's so many people. I hope there's so many people watching this, but it's a little scary. My next book I'm a little scared about, but not because of my main subject, who is my granddaughter. She's totally on board. I've interviewed her a number of times. If I have a question, I text her and she texts back. She's totally on board with it. And so is my other older granddaughter, because she's a little bit involved in the story as well. But I haven't really, I'm doing it. I am of the school that I do it. And then I will definitely put it out to them, because I did with this book say to them, this book is being published. You're in this book, that we were all sitting around in the living room. Do you want to take a look at the manuscript? And everybody said, no, we trust you, Mom.
That's so nice.
I
Oh my
know.
goodness.
I know.
Somewhere in your youth or childhood, you must have done something good to get that reaction. Okay, we have time for one last question, although I could talk to you for so many more hours about all the things. Now that you've written this book, what are some of the things you wish your younger self knew or understood back then? That is a great question.
Is everything a good answer?
Yes, everything is a great. I wish I knew all the things.
Well, at this age, you do, as you age, get quite a bit older. You contemplate your life, and you contemplate these kinds of questions. And I've been thinking about how much each of us is a product of our time and our family, and how some of us have the courage to break molds a little bit sooner than others. I've always done this, but within the confines of acceptability. I've never gone like, I think of the chicken and the egg and the bursting out. I have never burst out. I pecked away a lot. So I can't turn back time. I think that, and I'm not original saying this, I think regret is a useless emotion. Mm. And I'm embracing my life right now.
I love that answer so much. I have nothing else that I could possibly say that would ever top that. So I will just thank you for being with us today, and to say to everybody, in the spirit of Sandell and the Spiral Shell, live your lives in a way that doesn't induce regret. And if you feel regret, toss it out the window, because it is a useless emotion. And always do the thing that inspires you. We are inspired by your bravery in writing this, and inspired by all your hard work, and wish you Godspeed with the next memoir, which we will read, whatever it's called.
Thank you.
Aw, you're so welcome.
Jenna.
Aw, I love you too, honey.